In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Imagine that. Almost 2,000 years ago, and if you wanted to get people upset, just talk about taxes. Hard to believe that it still works. Well, what was happening in this story, and again, to put the context of when this was, this all occurred, in fact, all we've been reading in the last week, all of this has occurred between Palm Sunday and Good Friday. And Jesus, on Palm Sunday, challenged the authority of the leaders of Jerusalem and all of Israel. He did it very directly by riding into Jerusalem on a donkey with people waving hosannas, which was a way of saying, without saying it, that he was the rightful king and ruler. And then he went to the temple and he made a whip of cords and he drove out the money changers and he drove out the people who were selling animals for sacrifice, etc. That was a pretty direct challenge. And for the rest of the week, he was coming to the temple to teach, and so the leaders were trying to find ways to counter him. They very much wanted to get rid of him. He was trouble. So in today's story, the Pharisees, and these would be the ruling part of the ruling Sanhedrin or Council of Jerusalem, the Pharisees in that, were going to try to catch Jesus. And they said them along with some of the Herodians. Now, Herod was tetrarch who was ruler in Galilee, and these were also powerful people whom Jesus challenged. They were going to come and try to trick him into making people mad. So, first they flattered him with false flattery. "Oh, teacher, we know that you're sincere and show deference to no one," etc. And then they laid the trap. "So, is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not?" There's no good answer to that one, is there? There's more to this story, though, than meets the modern eye. Because in the Greek, it tells you what specific tax they were talking about. The tax is the kenson in Greek. It's the head tax. It was really hated. I mean, hated beyond belief. It was a Roman tax. So the Romans were already seen as an occupying power. They were not considered friendly. And the thing about the kenson, the head tax, is it didn't matter how rich or poor you were, everybody paid the same tax. That's today in economics, we call that a regressive tax. It was not popular. It was no big deal to the wealthy to pay 1 denarius. That's the price of their head, so to speak. But it was a whole day's wages for a poor person, a poor laborer, which meant if he paid the kenson that day, if he didn't have any savings, he and his family wouldn't eat. It was not a particularly friendly tax in that way. So this was the setup. All right? There's no good way to say it. Does he want to say, defy Rome, don't pay the tax? Then, for sure, Pontius Pilate was going to crucify him. Or would he say, pay the tax, and then everybody hates him because he's collaborating with the Romans? No good answer to that. Jesus, aware of the fact that they were trying to trap him then, says, "Oh, you hypocrites, show me the coin." So they pull out a denarius. And of course, it would have had a picture of the emperor at the time, Tiberius Caesar. And, so whose head is on this? Whose inscription? Well, Caesar's. And then he says what's famous, of course. "Therefore, pay to the emperor Caesar what is the emperor's, but to God the things that are God's." And that kind of ended the debate. But he never answers either of the question is, what then are the things that are God? I mean, most sermons I've heard on this, they take off on that one. But I want to ask a different question when Jesus asks this question. When Jesus gives this Pay to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and pay to God the things that are God's. If we assume, or if we know from our faith that God is demanding righteousness and justice, and that we pursue that in our lives, the question then for us, I think also is, in the light of that, giving to God what is God's, seeking righteousness and justice and peace, what should we give to the emperor? What is a moral tax? Especially in a representative democracy like we live in today, what's moral? What would God call a country to do to tax itself? Knowing that taxes are in fact necessary for government to function. Now, I'll stop to a degree and say there's no one answer to that question. And the point of this is really not to come up with an answer to the question, but to frame the way we think about it. How would we go about evaluating what is moral in terms of how we govern ourselves and how we tax ourselves? I've said often, and I'll say it again, I consider the gospel to be very political. It deals with the issues of our lives, such as taxation, such as how we treat the poor, such as how we do a lot of things. But it's not partisan. God's neither a Democrat or Republican or anything else. God calls us to a sincere way of living in relationship to God, and that's marked by justice and righteousness. Jim Wallace, who is the president of Sojourners and an evangelical pastor, likes to remind people all the time that budgets are moral documents. We make decisions in governmental budgets, whether they're at the local level all the way up to the federal level. They affect how people live. They are moral in how they deal with people. And the same would be true then in how we tax ourselves. They are moral. They make decisions as to who pays and who doesn't pay and the like. And again, without getting into which is right or wrong, we can think about what would a moral, godly budget and taxing regime look like. If we look at the New Testament, if we look at the Scriptures, there's no one way to do it, but one way that I think is a good starting point would be the gospel we're going to read on the last Sunday after Pentecost this year. Matthew 25, the parable of the sheep and the goats, where the king, the great shepherd, comes and separates the people like the shepherd separates sheep and goats, and he turns to the sheep and he says, welcome you who are beloved of my Father. Why? Because I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you cared for me. I was a stranger, immigrant, refugee, and you welcomed me. I was in prison and you visited me. And they say, well, when did we do that for you? And Jesus says, whenever you did it for any of the least of one of these, my brothers and sisters, you did it for me. And of course, he turns then to the goats and he says, be gone with you. Why? Because I was hungry and you didn't give me anything to eat. And I was thirsty and you didn't give me anything to drink, etc. The thing about that particular parable, it is the only place in the Gospels that Jesus describes anything about what the content of our judgment will be. It's the only place. It's not like that's the only thing we can be judged on, but it's the only parable, story, or anything that Jesus said that says anything about how we're going to be judged or how we are being judged. And so it says something about what God expects is for us to take care of each other, for us to look out for people who are more vulnerable than ourselves, that we should respect the dignity of every human being, whether she is rich or poor or somewhere in between. And that there is a sense of the flourishing and well-being of all human beings that we should always be cognizant of. That if God created every single human being in God's image, every single one is precious in God's sight. Everyone is valued simply for being who they are, and therefore we are to value them as well. Given that, when we look at taxing regimes and budgets and the like, to the extent that they favor some people over others, to the extent that some people may be devalued rather than valued, they become immoral. They're more moral to the point that they care for and set up a regime where everyone has an opportunity to flourish. We're about to head into a debate in this country about a rather huge change to the tax law. So I want to challenge all of us just to pay attention. I don't want to say we should come at this as being Democrats or Republicans, because God isn't on either side of that one. But to ask the question, is this something that promotes righteousness? Does it help every human being that God has made to flourish? Or does it do something else that devalues human beings? To what extent each? To what extent is it moral? Because we owe that much. When we give to Caesar, when we give our taxes in the light of the prior commitment we made to God through Jesus Christ, to do our part for this to be a moral and a godly place where justice and righteousness and peace that God promoted, that Jesus gave his life for, is our main thing. So I would encourage us all to pay attention, and to the extent we can, to let those decision makers whom we've elected know. Amen.